The wind moved across the Nebraska prairie like something searching, bending the tall grass in waves that looked almost like water if you didn't know better. Cole Bennett stood at the edge of 25 acres he'd just bought for $25 at the county tax auction, land so worthless that nobody else had even bothered to bid. The earth beneath his boots was hard and cracked, the soil the color of disappointment, and in the distance the skeletal remains of an old barn listed sideways like a drunk trying to remember which way was up. 26 years old and broke enough that $25 felt like a fortune. Cole had gambled everything on this purchase. The auction clerk had looked at him with something between pity and contempt when he'd raised his hand for the bid, and afterward, 3 separate locals had pulled him aside to warn him about the land. "That's the old Harmon place," an elderly woman named Dorothy had said, her voice low and serious. "Nothing good ever came from that property. Nothing ever will. People who try to work it end up worse than when they started. It's cursed, son. Some places just are." Cole didn't believe in curses. He believed in hard work and second chances and the stubborn refusal to accept that some lives were meant to stay poor forever. But standing here now, with twilight painting the prairie in shades of amber and shadow, he understood why superstition clung to this place like morning fog that never quite burned off. He'd pitched his tent near where the barn used to have a well, hoping to find water that would make camping bearable while he surveyed the property, and decided what to do with land that looked like it had given up decades ago. His truck, a 20-year-old Ford held together by rust and prayer, sat nearby, everything he owned in the world packed in its bed or stuffed in his tent. The bankruptcy had taken his family's farm 6 months ago. His father's heart attack had come 2 months after that, as if losing the land had pulled some essential support beam from the architecture of the old man's will to live. Cole's mother had moved in with his sister in Iowa, and Cole had been drifting since, working day labor jobs and sleeping in his truck, saving every dollar until he had enough to make one desperate bet on his own future. This cursed prairie was that bet. Night fell fast out here, darkness spreading like spilled ink, and Cole built a small fire from dead branches he'd collected from the ruined barn. He ate cold beans straight from the can and tried not to think about the warnings, about the way Dorothy's eyes had looked when she'd called the land cursed, about the particular quality of silence that pressed down on this place like the weight of accumulated years. He woke at 3 in the morning to a sound that didn't belong. Hooves on hard ground, labored breathing, the shuffle of something large moving with the awkward gait of injury or exhaustion. Cole sat up fast, his heart hammering, and grabbed the flashlight he kept by his sleeping bag. The beam caught movement at the edge of his campsite. A horse stood there, swaying slightly, its head lowered almost to the ground. Even in the uncertain light, Cole could see the animal was in terrible shape, ribs visible beneath a coat matted with mud and old blood, wounds on its legs that looked infected, a quality of brokenness that went beyond physical injury. The horse's eyes found Cole's, and in them, the young farmer saw something he recognized from his own reflection in recent months, the particular desperation of creatures who'd been abandoned and had nowhere left to turn. "Easy," Cole said softly, moving slowly as he climbed from his tent. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse didn't bolt, just stood there trembling, too weak to run, even if fear demanded it. Cole approached carefully, hands visible and non-threatening, speaking in the low voice his father had taught him to use with frightened animals back when they still had animals to speak to. Up close, the damage was worse than Cole had initially thought. Deep cuts from barbed wire, burns that looked like rope marks from restraints pulled too tight, starvation so severe that the horse's legs barely supported his weight. This wasn't neglect. This was cruelty, deliberate and sustained. Cole's hands curled into fists at his sides, rage burning hot and clean through the exhaustion and poverty and despair that had become his constant companions. Someone had done this. Someone had taken a living creature and broken it through violence and abandonment, and that someone deserved consequences Cole wasn't in any position to deliver. But he could do something, maybe the only thing that mattered. He could refuse to let this horse die alone on cursed land that everyone had given up on. "Okay," Cole said, more to himself than the horse. "Okay, we're going to fix this, somehow." He spent the rest of the night beside the horse, keeping watch, offering water from his dwindling supply, speaking softly about nothing and everything, And as the hours passed and the stars wheeled overhead in patterns his father had taught him to read, Cole found himself remembering. He was 8 years old again, standing in the barn of the farm that would eventually be lost, watching his father work with a mare who'd been abused by her previous owner. The horse had been wild-eyed and violent, kicking at anyone who came near, convinced that all humans meant pain. "See how she watches us, Cole?" his father had said, his voice patient and kind. "She's not mean. She's scared. Someone taught her that people cause hurt. Now, we have to teach her something different. That's the hardest kind of teaching there is, replacing bad lessons with good ones. Takes time, takes patience, takes refusing to give up, even when it looks hopeless." Cole had watched his father work with that mare for months, never forcing, never rushing, just offering gentleness day after day, until the horse finally understood that not all humans were the same. Eventually, that mare had become the gentlest horse on their farm, the one they'd let children ride because she was so careful and protective. "Remember this, son," his father had told him one evening, while they brushed the mare together. "The most broken things often become the strongest once they heal, because they know what it costs to survive. They know the value of second chances. And they never take gentleness for granted because they remember what the opposite feels like." Sitting beside this dying stallion on this cursed prairie in the middle of the night, Cole understood what his father had really been teaching him. Not just how to work with horses, but how to recognize when something broken was worth fighting for. How to see value that others had overlooked. How to believe that healing was possible even when everyone else had given up. The horse drank a little more water, stood a little straighter, and when dawn finally broke across the prairie in shades of pink and gold, Cole saw him clearly for the first time. This wasn't just any horse. Even in his broken state, even starved and wounded and defeated, there was quality in his build, good bone structure, a refined head, proportions that spoke of breeding and value. This horse had come from somewhere important, had belonged to someone who should have known better than to let him end up dying on abandoned prairie. Cole made the decision quickly, before caution or common sense could interfere. He had $43 left to his name. The nearest veterinarian was in Ashford, 12 miles down a road that barely deserved the name. He had no way to trailer the horse, which meant walking him there if the animal could manage it. But before they could start that journey, Cole needed to prepare. He gave the horse more water, spoke to him softly, and felt the weight of the choice he was making. $43 was everything. If the vet bill exceeded that, which it almost certainly would, Cole would be in debt before he even started trying to develop this land. He'd be betting his entire future on a horse he'd known for less than 6 hours. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was foolish, that he should walk away, let nature take its course, focus on his own survival rather than trying to save a creature who might die anyway, despite his best efforts. But the part of him that was his father's son, the part that remembered those lessons about broken things and second chances, that part knew he didn't really have a choice. Some decisions weren't about logic or self-preservation. They were about who you chose to be when nobody was watching except your own conscience. "Come on," Cole said, fashioning a makeshift lead rope from the climbing rope in his truck. "We're going to get you help, even if it bankrupts me. Even if everyone thinks I'm crazy. You didn't give up and wander here to die. You came here to be saved, so that's what we're going to do." The horse took one unsteady step forward, then another, and together, a broke farmer and a broken horse, they began the slow journey toward Ashford, toward help, toward whatever consequences would follow from Cole's decision to save a life when he could barely save his own. The prairie stretched around them, vast and indifferent, and Cole thought about Dorothy's warning, cursed land. Nothing good ever came from it. But maybe curses were just challenges that nobody had been brave enough or desperate enough to face. Maybe redemption started with refusing to accept that some things were beyond saving. The walk took 6 hours. 6 hours of slow progress through heat that built as morning gave way to afternoon, through terrain that tested both man and horse, through moments when Cole wasn't sure either of them would make it. The horse stumbled repeatedly, his legs giving out, and each time Cole would stop and wait, while the animal gathered strength to continue. They rested in whatever shade they could find, under the occasional tree, beside abandoned farm equipment that had rusted into abstract sculptures. Cole shared his water, his crackers, his absolute conviction that they would reach Ashford even if it took all day and into the night. My dad would have liked you, Cole told the horse during one rest stop, both of them sitting in the shade of an old grain silo. He had this thing about animals, said you could tell everything about a person's character by how they treated creatures who couldn't fight back or pay them back. Said the truest test of humanity was what you did for those who could offer you nothing in return. The horse's ears swiveled toward Cole's voice, and the young farmer imagined he saw understanding in those eyes. He would have stopped for you too, would have walked you 12 miles just like I'm doing. Probably would have done it faster and with less complaining. Cole smiled despite his exhaustion. I miss him. Miss having someone who believed I could be better than my circumstances. Everyone else looks at me now and sees failure, but he would have seen someone trying, and to him, that would have been enough. The sun climbed higher, and they kept walking. Two damaged souls moving towards something that might be hope, or might be just another disappointment in a long line of disappointments. But at least they were moving. At least they were trying. And sometimes, Cole was beginning to understand, trying was enough to break curses that existed only because everyone had stopped believing they could be broken. Dr. Rachel Moore had been the veterinarian in Ashford for 15 years, long enough to recognize desperation when it walked through her door. The young man who appeared at her clinic just after noon, leading a horse that should have been dead, both of them coated in dust and exhaustion, wore desperation like a second skin. I found him on my property, the young man said, without preamble. He needs help. I don't have much money, but I'll work it off. I'll do whatever you need. Just please help him. Rachel had learned early in her career that the measure of people revealed itself in how they treated animals who couldn't repay them. This young man, who introduced himself as Cole Bennett, had walked 12 miles with a dying horse to get it, help he couldn't afford. That told her everything she needed to know about his character. Let's get him inside, she said. We'll worry about payment later. The examination took 2 hours. Rachel cleaned and treated the wounds, administered antibiotics and fluids, took x-rays that revealed old fractures that had healed wrong. The horse stood through it all with the patient endurance of creatures who'd learned that resistance only brought more pain. He's a stallion, Rachel said finally, washing her hands while Cole watched from the corner of the examination room. 5 years old, give or take. And unless I'm very mistaken, he's from champion bloodlines. Look at his conformation, his build. This isn't some ranch horse. This is serious breeding stock. Then why would someone abandon him? That's what we need to find out. Rachel pulled out her scanner and checked for a microchip. The device beeped, displaying a registration number that made her eyebrows rise. He's chipped, registered through the American Quarter Horse Association. Let me look this up. She typed the number into her computer, and the file that appeared made her go very still. Cole, this horse is registered as Storm's Crown. Owner of record is Marcus Harmon of Harmon Breeding Ranch. Cole's face went pale. Harmon? Like the old Harmon place? The property I just bought? You bought the Harmon property? Rachel's voice was sharp with surprise. Cole, that family, there were rumors, bad ones. Marcus Harmon ran breeding operations that were questioned by every legitimate organization in the state. There were allegations of illegal practices, of cruelty, of falsifying bloodlines. But he had money and lawyers, and nothing ever stuck. 3 years ago, the ranch went bankrupt, and the property was abandoned. Marcus disappeared. People assumed he'd left the state. But if this is his horse, then he didn't leave. Or he came back. Rachel looked at Storm's Crown with new understanding. This horse was left to die, deliberately. Someone wanted him gone, but couldn't risk selling him or having him traced back. They were interrupted by the clinic door opening. A man entered, 50-ish, expensive boots, and a Stetson that looked more costume than workwear. His eyes went immediately to Storm's Crown, and something flickered across his face. Recognition and anger. That's my horse, he said flatly. I'm Marcus Harmon. That stallion belongs to me, and I'm taking him back. Cole stepped between Harmon and the horse instinctively. This horse was dying on my property. Property I bought legally at auction because you let it go to tax. Sale. You abandoned him. I did no such thing. He escaped. I've been searching for him for weeks. Harmon's smile was cold and practiced. I have papers proving ownership. You found my stolen property, and I appreciate that. But Storm's Crown comes with me. Now. Rachel cleared her throat. Mr. Harmon, this horse shows evidence of sustained abuse and deliberate starvation. If you're claiming ownership, I'm required by law to report suspected animal cruelty. You'd report a man for losing a horse that ran off? That's nature, Dr. Moore. Animals get hurt in the wild. Harmon's voice hardened. I'll be back with the sheriff and my ownership papers. Don't even think about moving that stallion. He left, and the silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Cole looked at Rachel, then at Storm's crown, then back at the veterinarian who was already pulling out her phone. We need a lawyer, Rachel said, and we need one who understands animal welfare law and isn't afraid of men like Marcus Harmon. The name Thomas Wright came up repeatedly in Rachel's search, an attorney based in Lincoln who'd made his career prosecuting animal cruelty cases, often working pro bono or on contingency for plaintiffs who couldn't afford representation. Rachel left a message, not expecting much. High-profile lawyers rarely returned calls from small-town vets about horses. But Thomas called back within an hour. "Tell me about the horse," he said without introduction, and Rachel could hear the sharp focus of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of call. She explained everything, the condition Storm's crown had been in, the microchip registration, Marcus Harmon's sudden appearance and ownership claim. There was a long pause when she finished. "I've been trying to build a case against Harmon for 6 years, Thomas said finally. "Every time I get close, witnesses disappear or recant. Evidence goes missing. He's got connections, political ones, law enforcement ones. But if you've got documentation of that horse's condition, if you've got testimony about finding him abandoned on Harmon's former property, this might be the opening I've been waiting for." "When can you get here?" Rachel asked. "I'm already packing." Thomas Wright arrived in Ashford the next morning, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and the particular intensity of lawyers who'd chosen passion over profit. He examined Storm's crown, reviewed Rachel's medical documentation, and interviewed Cole with the thoroughness of someone building a case brick by careful brick. "Here's what we're facing," Thomas said as they sat in Rachel's office that evening. "Marcus Harmon has legal ownership papers. In the eyes of the law, Storm's crown is his property. To challenge that, we need to prove either that the horse was abandoned, which means Harmon deliberately left him to die, or that Harmon's ownership should be terminated due to cruelty. Both are difficult to prove." "But you've seen the medical evidence," Cole protested. "You've seen what was done to him." "I have, and it's compelling. But Harmon will claim the horse escaped and sustained those injuries in the wild. He'll say he's been searching frantically. He'll play the role of the concerned owner whose valuable stallion was stolen or lost." Thomas leaned forward. "What we need are witnesses, people who worked for Harmon, people who saw what really happened." "Nobody's going to testify against him," Rachel said quietly. "Everyone in this region knows his reputation. He destroys people who cross him. Then we find someone brave enough or guilty enough that they can't stay silent anymore." Thomas pulled out a file folder. "I've been compiling a list of former Harmon employees for years. Most won't talk. But maybe, with a specific case, with a horse that can be saved if they come forward, maybe one of them will find the courage." The search for witnesses took days. Thomas made calls, drove to addresses scattered across 3 counties, knocked on doors of people who'd worked for Marcus Harmon, and carried secrets they'd been too frightened to share. Most refused to talk. Some slammed doors in his face. A few made threats. But one person listened. Helen Crawford had worked as a stable hand at Harmon Breeding Ranch for 3 years before quitting abruptly in the summer 3 years ago. She lived now in a small apartment in Grand Island, working 2 jobs to support her teenage daughter. And when Thomas showed up at her door, she looked at him with the weary recognition of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. "I know why you're here," she said. "It's about Storm's crown, isn't it? The stallion Marcus left to die." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "You know about that?" "I was there. I saw him do it." Helen's hands shook as she invited Thomas inside. "I've carried that guilt every day since, but I was scared. Marcus threatened me, threatened my daughter, said if I ever talked about what happened at that ranch, he'd make sure I never worked in this state again. Said he had friends who could make life very difficult for people who crossed him. Helen, I can protect you, the law can protect you, but I need you to tell me what you saw." She sat down heavily on her worn couch and began to speak. The story that emerged was one of systematic cruelty. Horses kept in substandard conditions, breeding practices that violated regulations, a pattern of abuse designed to break spirited animals into submission, and Storm's crown had been too spirited, too difficult, too expensive to simply sell off or put down in a way that might attract attention. Marcus drove him out to that old property he'd abandoned, the one that went to tax sale, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. He tied Storm's crown to a post with barely enough rope for him to move. No food, no water, just left him there in the August heat. Said the land was cursed anyway, that nobody would ever buy it or develop it, that by the time anyone found the horse, there'd be nothing left but bones and nobody would be able to prove anything. Why didn't you report it? I tried. I called the county sheriff, but the deputy who showed up was Marcus's cousin. He took my statement and said he'd investigate. Nothing happened. Then Marcus showed up at my apartment and told me if I valued my daughter's safety, I'd forget what I'd seen and quit quietly. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I quit. I ran. I've hated myself every day since. But my daughter, I couldn't risk her. Thomas reached across and took her hand. Helen, testifying against Marcus now, it won't erase what happened, but it could prevent it from happening to other horses, other people, and it could save Storm's crown from being returned to the man who tried to kill him. Will I have to face Marcus in court? Yes, and it won't be easy. He'll try to discredit you, to make you look like a disgruntled former employee making false accusations. But you won't be alone. We'll have medical evidence. We'll have Cole's testimony about finding Storm's crown on that exact property. We'll have a pattern of behavior from other witnesses if I can find them. Your testimony could be the piece that makes everything else fall into place. Helen was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of remaining silent. Finally, she looked up. What do I need to do? The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, giving Thomas time to build his case and Cole time to move into a room above the Ashford feed store, rent donated by the owner who'd heard his story and believed in second chances. Storm's crown remained at Rachel's clinic, recovering slowly, gaining weight and strength while his fate was decided by people arguing in rooms he'd never see. Cole visited the stallion daily, bringing apples he couldn't afford and spending hours brushing the horse's coat, speaking softly about the farm he wanted to build, the future he hoped they'd both have. Storm's crown listened with the patience of creatures who would learn to take comfort where they could find it, and gradually something shifted in his eyes. The terror was fading. The mistrust was loosening its grip. Healing was happening in ways that went beyond physical wounds. The night before the hearing, Cole couldn't sleep. He lay in the small room above the feed store, listening to the sounds of Ashford settling into darkness, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. If fighting for Storm's crown would cost him the little he had left. If Marcus Harmon's lawyers would destroy him in court, leaving him worse off than when he'd started. But then he thought about his father's lessons, about broken things deserving second chances, about measuring your life by what you fought for rather than what you won. And he understood that even if he lost tomorrow, even if Storm's crown was taken away, he would have done the right thing. And sometimes that had to be enough. The courtroom was smaller than Cole had expected, less dramatic than television had led him to believe. Judge Catherine Norton presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for having no patience for legal games or manipulative tactics. Marcus Harmon sat with his lawyers, expensive suits and confident expressions, acting like men who'd already won. Thomas presented his case methodically. Medical evidence from Rachel documenting Storm's crown's condition, photographs of the injuries, Cole's testimony about finding the stallion on the Harmon property, about the $25 land purchase at tax auction. Each piece built on the previous one, creating a picture of deliberate abandonment. Then Helen took the stand. She was terrified. Cole could see it in the way her hands shook, the way her voice wavered on the first few words. Marcus stared at her with barely concealed fury, and his lawyers objected to nearly every question Thomas asked, trying to rattle her, trying to break her composure. But Thomas was patient, and Helen was determined. She told her story slowly and clearly, about working at Harmon Breeding Ranch, about the conditions she'd witnessed, about the day Marcus had driven Storm's crown to the abandoned property and left him tied without food or water. Why did Mr. Harmon do this? Thomas asked. Storm's crown was valuable but difficult. Marcus couldn't control him through normal methods, and the horse fought back when mistreated. Marcus said he was tired of dealing with him, that it was cheaper to let him die than to keep feeding an animal he couldn't break. Helen's voice grew stronger as she continued. He said nobody would ever find the body, that the land was cursed and would never be developed, that Storm's crown would just disappear, and eventually people would forget he'd ever existed. Harmon's lawyer cross-examined her viciously, suggesting she was lying out of spite, that she'd been fired for incompetence and was seeking revenge. But Helen held firm, her testimony consistent, her details too specific to be fabrication. "Did you witness Mr. Harmon physically abuse Storm's crown?" the lawyer demanded. "Yes, multiple times. I saw him hit the horse with a lead rope when Storm's crown wouldn't cooperate. Saw him use spurs until the horse bled. Saw him keep animals in stalls too small, with inadequate food and water, because he said it was cheaper than proper care. And yet, you continued working for him?" "I needed the job. I was a single mother with bills to pay. I reported what I saw to the county, but nothing happened. So I quit. But I never forgot what Marcus did to that horse." When Helen stepped down from the witness stand, Cole saw tears on her face, not from fear but from relief. She'd carried this secret for 3 years, and speaking it aloud had lifted something heavy from her shoulders. Other witnesses followed. Former employees Thomas had, finally convinced to testify, veterinarians who'd refused to work with Harmon due to his treatment of animals, neighbors who'd reported concerns to authorities that had been ignored. The picture that emerged was damning, a pattern of cruelty and neglect spanning years, hidden behind legal paperwork and political connections. Marcus Harmon took the stand in his own defense, smooth and confident, explaining that Storm's crown had escaped during a storm, that he'd been searching frantically, that he'd loved his horses and would never deliberately harm them. But Thomas's cross-examination was surgical, pointing out inconsistencies, questioning why Harmon hadn't reported the escape to authorities, why he'd only shown up after Rachel had scanned the microchip and the horse's location became known. "Mr. Harmon, isn't it true that you abandoned Storm's crown on your former property because he was too difficult to control and you didn't want the expense of proper training or humane euthanasia? That's absurd. Isn't it true that you've been investigated multiple times for animal welfare violations? Those investigations found nothing because witnesses were intimidated into silence, because evidence disappeared, because you used your connections to make problems go away." Thomas's voice was cold with controlled anger. "But you couldn't make Storm's crown disappear, could you? Because a young man with $25 and a conscience found him before he died. And now everyone can see what you really are." The judge's ruling came after 2 hours of deliberation. Judge Norton returned to the bench with an expression that gave nothing away, but Cole felt his stomach twist with anticipation that bordered on nausea. "I've reviewed the evidence and testimony presented here," Judge Norton said, "and I find the testimony of Ms. Crawford and other witnesses to be credible and compelling. The medical evidence supports a finding that Storm's crown was subjected to deliberate abuse and abandonment. Mr. Harmon's claim that the horse simply escaped is not consistent with the facts as presented." Cole's hands gripped the edge of his chair. "Therefore, I am ruling that ownership of Storm's crown be transferred to Mr. Cole Bennett, who rescued the animal and has demonstrated appropriate care and concern for its welfare. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into Harmon Breeding Ranch's operations, past and present, to determine if criminal charges for animal cruelty are warranted." The courtroom erupted. Harmon's lawyers shouted objections. Helen sobbed with relief. Rachel grabbed Cole's hand and squeezed it hard enough to hurt, and Thomas Wright allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the expression of a man who'd been fighting this battle for 6 years and had finally won. Marcus Harmon stood, his face purple with rage. "This is ridiculous. That horse is worth hundreds of thousands in breeding fees. You can't just give him to some broke kid who doesn't know the first thing about—" "This hearing is concluded, Mr. Harmon," Judge Norton interrupted. "You're dismissed, and I suggest you secure legal counsel for the criminal investigation that will be forthcoming." Cole stood outside the courthouse afterward, Storm's crown's ownership papers clutched in his hands, surrounded by Rachel and Thomas and Helen, trying to process that this impossible thing had actually happened. He'd saved a horse he couldn't afford to feed, And in doing so, he had exposed crimes that had been hidden for years and claimed ownership of an animal who was worth, according to the experts Thomas had consulted, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in breeding fees. But none of that mattered as much as the look in Storm's Crown's eyes when Cole returned to the clinic that evening. The stallion recognized him, whinnied softly, and pressed his face against Cole's chest. Not in fear or desperation now, but in something that looked almost like gratitude, like understanding that something fundamental had shifted, that he was safe now, that he'd found someone who wouldn't abandon him. "You're mine now," Cole whispered, his voice breaking. "Legally, officially, nobody can take you away. And I promise you, I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that kind of fear again." Storm's crown breathed softly against Cole's neck, and in that moment, in that simple exchange of trust and commitment, both of them understood they'd saved each other. The broke farmer and the broken horse, bound together now by law and choice and the stubborn refusal to accept that some things were beyond redemption. Robert Moore arrived at the Prairie property on a cold November morning, his truck loaded with equipment that Cole didn't recognize but that looked expensive and official. The old engineer walked the land for 3 hours, taking readings, drilling test holes, checking maps he'd brought from his years working for the county. When he finally returned to where Cole waited by the restored well, his weathered face held an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been vindication. "Your land sits on top of an underground aquifer," Robert said without preamble. "A big one. Been telling the county for years that the Harmon property had water access that could support significant agricultural development, but nobody listened. Harmon himself probably didn't even know what he had. He was too focused on his breeding operations to think about the land itself." Cole felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope yet, but maybe the foundation that hope could be built on. "What does that mean?" "It means you've got water, reliable, clean water. In this part of Nebraska, that's worth more than gold. You could irrigate crops, support livestock, develop this prairie into productive farmland that would be sustainable for generations." Robert paused, looking at the land with the kind of appreciation that came from truly understanding its value. "I'd like to help you develop it, not for money, for the challenge, for the satisfaction of proving that land everyone wrote off can become something valuable." The development took time. Robert brought in contacts, engineers who designed irrigation systems, soil specialists who tested and amended the earth, farmers who provided advice and sometimes labor. Cole worked dawn to dusk, learning as he went, transforming 25 acres of cursed prairie into something that looked increasingly like the farm his father had lost. And Storm's Crown became the heart of it all. As the stallion's health returned, so did his presence, the powerful build, the intelligent eyes, the bloodline that ran back through generations of champion horses. Word spread through the ethical breeding community about the rescue horse on the Nebraska prairie, about his documented heritage, about the young farmer who'd saved him from deliberate cruelty. Offers came, breeding partnerships, stud fees that made Cole's hands shake when he saw the numbers. Trainers who wanted to work with Storm's Crown to see if the spirit that had been beaten down could be rebuilt into something magnificent. Cole accepted partnerships carefully, choosing people who saw horses as partners rather than products, who understood that Storm's Crown deserved respect after everything he'd survived. One of those partners was a breeder named Diana Foster, who ran an ethical operation in Colorado and had been fighting against practices like Harmon's for decades. "I want to breed Storm's Crown with my mare, Silver Morning," Diana said during her first visit to the farm. "She's got the temperament and bloodline to complement his genetics. If we're careful, if we do this right, their offspring could be extraordinary." "And if it doesn't work?" Cole asked. "Then we try again, or we don't. This isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about giving these horses the chance to be what they were meant to be: healthy, respected, cared for. Everything else is secondary." The breeding happened in the spring, carefully managed and supervised, with Storm's Crown showing a gentleness towards Silver Morning that surprised even experienced handlers. It was as if he understood, on some level, that this was different from what had come before, that this wasn't about exploitation or profit, but about honoring what he could give freely. 11 months later, on a cold February morning, Cole received the call from Diana. Silver Morning had gone into labor. The foal was coming. He drove through the night to reach Diana's ranch in Colorado, arriving just as dawn broke across the mountains. The barn was warm and quiet except for Silver Morning's breathing, the mare laboring through contractions while Diana and her veterinarian monitored every stage. First foals can be complicated, Diana explained as Cole stood watching. But she's doing well, strong, just like her sire. The foal arrived just after sunrise, a filly dark bay with Storm's Crown's distinctive blaze, all legs and vulnerability and promise. She struggled to stand within minutes, wobbling on limbs that didn't quite know their purpose yet, and when she finally found her feet and began nursing, Cole felt tears on his face that he didn't bother wiping away. "She's perfect," Diana said softly, standing beside Cole. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name her?" Cole thought about the journey that had led here, about cursed land and abandoned horses, about his father's lessons and the stallion who'd appeared in the night, about how broken things could heal and become whole again if someone cared enough to fight for them. "Dawn's Promise," he said, "because she represents everything we hoped for." Diana smiled. "Dawn's Promise. I like that. It fits." The first stud fees paid off the last of Cole's debts. The second funded a proper barn, built where the old one had collapsed, but stronger now, built to last. The third and fourth established an account that meant Cole would never be as broke as he'd been the day he bought cursed land for $25. But more valuable than the money was what was growing on that prairie, a farm that operated on principles of care rather than cruelty, horses that were partners rather than products, a demonstration that ethical practices and financial success weren't opposites but could exist together if you had the courage to prioritize what mattered. Rachel became a regular presence at the farm, initially to monitor Storm's Crown's recovery, but eventually for reasons that had less to do with veterinary care and more to do with the quiet connection growing between her and Cole, two people who'd learned that fighting for things others had given up on created bonds that went deeper than convenience or common interest. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch of the farmhouse Cole had rebuilt, watching Storm's Crown graze with 3 mares in the field that had once been barren prairie. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold that made the ordinary look sacred. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Rachel asked, "when he appeared at your campsite?" "Every day," Cole admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored him, if I'd decided saving myself was more important than saving him." "You wouldn't have ignored him. That's not who you are." "Maybe not, but I could have convinced myself I couldn't afford to help, that it was too risky, that somebody else would find him and take responsibility." Cole looked at Rachel. "Instead, I spent my last $43 and walked 12 miles and got myself into a legal battle that could have destroyed me. None of it made logical sense. But it made moral sense. There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence, and Cole thought about how much had changed in 2 years, how the cursed prairie had become productive farmland, how Storm's Crown had gone from dying to thriving, to siring foals that were already showing promise in early training, how Cole himself had transformed from a broke drifter into someone building something sustainable and meaningful. A vehicle approached on the dirt road, unusual enough that both Cole and Rachel stood to see who was visiting. The truck that pulled up was old but well-maintained, and when the driver emerged, Cole's breath caught. Dorothy, the elderly woman who'd warned him about the cursed land at the auction 2 years ago. "Mrs. Winters," Cole said, using the last name he'd learned since moving to Ashford. "This is a surprise." Dorothy looked around at the farm with eyes that held wonder and something that might have been vindication. "I heard what you'd done with this place, heard the stories about the horse and the trial and everything that's happened since, but I needed to see it with my own eyes." "You were right about one thing," Cole said. "This land does have history, just not the kind you thought." "No, I was wrong about the curse. Or maybe—" Dorothy walked to the fence where Storm's Crown had approached, curious about the visitor. She reached out tentatively and touched the stallion's nose, her weathered hand gentle against his face. "Maybe the curse was real, but curses can be broken if someone's brave enough to face them. My husband tried to farm this land 40 years ago. Harmon bought him out after 3 failed harvests. Said the land was worthless, but I think now that Harmon wanted it worthless. Wanted everyone to believe it couldn't support life, so nobody would look too closely at what he was doing here. What do you mean? Harmon didn't just breed horses on this property. He dumped things here, evidence, animals he'd killed, records he wanted destroyed. He made sure everyone thought the land was cursed so they'd stay away, so nobody would dig and discover what he'd buried. Dorothy looked at Cole. You didn't just break a curse, young man. You uncovered truth that had been hidden for decades. And that takes a special kind of courage. After Dorothy left, Cole stood at the fence for a long time, processing what she'd said. The investigations into Marcus Harmon were still ongoing, and every few weeks brought new revelations about the scope of his operations. Evidence had been found on various properties he'd owned, records of illegal sales, photographs of abused animals, financial documents proving fraud. The cursed prairie had indeed been hiding secrets, but Cole had brought them to light by refusing to accept everyone's verdict about worthless land. 3 years after Cole bought the property, the farm had expanded to include 12 horses, Storm's Crown, and carefully selected mares whose bloodlines and temperaments matched the stallion's quality. Dawn's Promise was 2 years old now, in training with a gentle-handed expert who believed in Cole's philosophy of partnership over dominance. The fields produced healthy harvests of wheat and corn, fed by the aquifer Robert had discovered, and the barn, once a collapsed ruin, now stood solid and weatherproof, housing not just horses, but also the office where Cole managed breeding contracts and partnerships that stretched across 3 states. But it was a competition day in late autumn that truly demonstrated how far Storm's Crown had come. Diana had convinced Cole to enter Dawn's Promise in a regional show, not for the competition itself, but to show the breeding community what ethical practices could produce. Cole stood ringside, nervous despite Diana's assurances, watching Dawn's Promise move through her paces with a grace that took his breath away. She was beautiful, Storm's Crown's daughter in every elegant line, but with a confidence her father had never been allowed to develop until Cole had saved him. When Dawn's Promise took first place in her division, the crowd applauded. But what mattered more to Cole was the moment afterward when he brought Storm's Crown to the showgrounds to see his daughter receive her ribbon. The stallion stood calmly, watching the younger horse with what Cole could only interpret as pride, and people gathered, breeders and trainers and competitors who'd heard the story of the rescue horse and wanted to see him in person. "That's Storm's Crown?" a woman asked, awe in her voice. "He's magnificent. I'd heard about his bloodline, but seeing him in person..." "He's available for breeding partnerships," Diana said, always the businesswoman. "But Cole here only works with operations that meet specific ethical standards. Quality of life matters as much as quality of genetics." Several breeders approached Cole that day, interested in partnerships, asking about his standards and practices, and Cole explained patiently about proper care, about treating horses as individuals with needs and preferences, about building trust rather than enforcing obedience through fear. "It takes longer," Cole admitted, "and it costs more up front. But the horses are healthier, happier, and they pass that temperament on to their offspring. Dawn's Promise has never been hit or starved or terrorized. She's been taught with patience and respect. That's why she moves like that. That's why she's confident instead of frightened." One older breeder, a man who'd been in the industry for 40 years, listened carefully and then said something that stayed with Cole for years after. "Your father would be proud of you. Not just for saving that horse, but for remembering what really matters. A lot of us forgot that somewhere along the way. You're helping us remember." Rachel joined the farm officially in the 4th year, moving into the farmhouse Cole had renovated, bringing with her not just her veterinary expertise, but also the warmth that had been missing since his father's death. They married that spring in a simple ceremony, attended by everyone who'd been part of the journey: Thomas Wright, Helen, Crawford, Robert Moore, Diana Foster, and dozens of others who'd helped transform cursed prairie into productive farmland. Storm's Crown stood witness to the ceremony, decorated with flowers, looking almost amused by the human ritual happening in the barn he'd come to call home. And when Cole kissed his bride, the stallion whinnied approval, and the gathered crowd laughed at the perfect timing. But there was one more visitor who came, unannounced, 6 months after the wedding. Cole was working in the barn when he heard an unfamiliar vehicle approach. He stepped outside to find the expensive sedan pulling up, and from it emerged a young woman, early 20s, well-dressed, nervous. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked. "My name is Catherine Harmon. I was Marcus Harmon's daughter." Cole's entire body tensed, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What do you want?" "To apologize, and to see the horse my father tried to kill." Catherine's eyes were red, like she'd been crying recently. "I didn't know what he was doing. None of us did. My mother divorced him after the trial, and I changed my name. But I've been following the news about this farm, about Storm's Crown, about what you've built here, and I needed to see it, needed to understand what my father destroyed and what you saved." Cole studied her carefully, looking for deception or ulterior motive, but he saw only genuine remorse and curiosity. "Come with me," he said finally. He led her to the paddock where Storm's Crown stood with 3 of his daughters, Dawn's Promise, and 2 younger fillies. The stallion looked up as they approached, his eyes clear and calm, no trace of the terror that had defined him when Cole had first found him. "He's beautiful," Catherine whispered. "He looks happy." Is that possible for a horse to look happy? When they're treated right, yes. They can be happy. Cole rested his arms on the fence rail. "Your father hurt a lot of animals, did terrible things in the name of profit, but Storm's Crown survived, and from him, we're building something better, something that proves you don't have to choose between ethics and success. I wish I could undo what he did. You can't, but you can make different choices. You can support ethical operations. You can speak up when you see cruelty. You can be the person your father refused to be." Cole looked at her directly. "That's how you apologize for family sins. Not with words, but with different actions." Catherine nodded slowly, tears on her face. She stayed for an hour watching the horses, asking questions about Cole's practices and standards, and when she left, she donated a substantial sum to animal welfare organizations in Storm's Crown's name, her way of trying to balance scales that could never truly be, even but could at least tip slightly toward justice. 5 years after Cole bought the cursed prairie for $25, he stood at the same spot where he'd stood that first evening, looking out across fields that were now productive and valuable. But what he saw wasn't measured in dollars or harvests. It was measured in the horses grazing peacefully, in the barn that housed creatures who were partners rather than property, in the life he'd built from nothing except stubborn hope and the refusal to accept everyone else's verdict about worth and value. Storm's Crown approached the fence, older now, but still magnificent, still carrying himself with the dignity of a creature who'd survived the impossible and found purpose on the other side of suffering. Cole reached out and the stallion pressed his face against the farmer's hand, a gesture repeated so many times it had become ritual, a daily confirmation of the bond that had saved them both. "You know what today is?" Cole asked the horse, who couldn't understand words but could certainly understand tone. 5 years since I bought this land, 5 years since you appeared in the middle of the night and changed everything." Rachel joined them at the fence, slipping her hand into Cole's, her presence as natural as breathing. "Thinking about how it all started? Thinking about how everyone said this land was cursed, how they warned me nothing good could come from it, how they were so sure they were right. And now? Now I understand that curses are just other people's fear pretending to be truth. That worthless is a judgment made by people who don't look deep enough to see value, that sometimes the things everyone gives up on are exactly what's worth fighting for." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the prairie in the same amber light that had greeted Cole on his first night here. But everything else had changed. The broken farmer had built something sustainable. The abused horse had become the foundation of a breeding program that prioritized animal welfare and ethical practices. The cursed land had produced harvests that fed families and created jobs, and proved that redemption was possible even in places where hope had died. Storm's Crown whinnied softly, a sound of contentment that carried across the evening air, and Cole smiled, understanding finally what his father had been trying to teach him before the bankruptcy, before the heart attack, before the loss that had sent Cole wandering with nothing except stubborn hope that wouldn't quite die. That value wasn't determined by what others could see. That worth existed independent of market price or common opinion. That the most important thing you could do was refuse to give up on things that deserve saving, even when, especially when, everyone else already had. The prairie stretched around them, vast and productive, redeemed from curse through courage and care. And in the paddock, a stallion who'd been left to die stood healthy and proud, surrounded by his daughters, living proof that broken things could heal, that abandoned creatures could thrive, that sometimes the best investments were the ones that looked like terrible mistakes to everyone, except the person brave enough or desperate enough to believe otherwise. Cole turned from the fence and walked toward the farmhouse he'd built, Rachel beside him, Storm's crown secure in the paddock, the land productive beneath their feet. Children someday who would grow up learning that kindness mattered more than profit, and that seeing value in discarded things was the truest measure of wisdom. Behind them, the prairie whispered in the evening breeze, telling its story to anyone willing to listen. Not a curse after all, just a test, just a question asked of anyone who encountered it. Are you brave enough to see value where others see waste? Strong enough to fight for what everyone else has abandoned? Stubborn enough to prove that redemption is possible even in places where hope has died? Cole had answered yes, and the prairie, grateful for finally being seen, had given him everything in return. The stars emerged one by one, puncturing the darkness, and Storm's crown stood beneath them, no longer the dying horse who'd stumbled into a campsite, but a stallion who'd become legend. The rescue horse who'd exposed cruelty, whose survival had demanded justice, whose bloodline was changing the breeding industry, one ethical partnership at a time, and on the prairie that everyone had called cursed, on land that had been bought for $25 and transformed through stubborn refusal to accept conventional wisdom about worth. A young farmer and his wife stood watching their dreams take shape in flesh and blood and growing things. The curse had been broken, the abandoned had been saved, and from the ashes of one man's cruelty had risen something beautiful and sustainable and true. Dawn would come again tomorrow, as it always did, and Storm's crown would be there to greet it, standing tall in the place where he'd chosen to trust one more time, where he'd found the human who wouldn't abandon him, where broken things had become whole through the simple act of someone caring enough to try.